So, Rebecca, let's start with just explain to us what does it mean to be a voucher school?
Sure. So a voucher school is any private school that receives some amount of public funding via a state level program. So it is privately held, but the students there, some of the students there, at least some proportion of the students there, are on a publicly funded scholarship.
All right. So, I mean, I think people will, and people should not confuse this with charter schools, which are
hmm
privately run, funded by public school funds. In some states, charter schools have more oversight than in other states. And the charters are issued by the state. But private schools are completely private entities. There's absolutely zero oversight by any body outside of the private school administration. So, I mean, I think people would be surprised to know that voucher programs even exist, frankly, that we are subsidizing people to go to private schools. How widespread is that? How much more is someone like Betsy DeVos, who has been pushing this for as long as I have been aware of her involvement in education? How much are we seeing? How large of a phenomena is this?
So there are some form of a voucher program. They come in a few different types, but there's some form in 25 states and the District of Columbia, and they can range from being really large with most private schools in the state participating, like a place like Florida has a really big private tax credit program, or they can be pretty small, like in a state like Tennessee. I believe it's only something like 14 schools participate. So it really ranges based on where you are. In terms of the overall private school population in America and how many schools are participating, it's probably not that big, but Betsy DeVos would like that number to grow, and she has certainly made it clear that that's her number one priority in this administration.
So when we talk about these voucher programs, usually what we hear is we are sold like, look, this is a program to allow students, children of families who live in poverty to have the same opportunity to go to private schools as rich kids. Presumably, the idea is we're taking kids who live in a poor, poverty, poor area, and we're giving them money so they can go to, one of the top private schools. I mean, is that what we're talking about, or what is the reality? Like, who is getting this money, and who are they giving it to in terms of the private schools?
Sure. So it really depends on the state. Each state has different requirements for who is allowed to participate in these programs, whether it be what types of schools are allowed to participate or what types of students are allowed to participate. Typically, what you see is a program for students whose families make below a certain income level. So these programs are generally geared towards low-income students or students with specific disabilities whose needs might not be served in a traditional public school system. However, this idea that students are escaping failing public schools to go to elite private schools, there's not a lot of data bearing that out. In general, most programs don't collect a lot of data on how students do after they switch out of their public school. So we're kind of in the dark on that. The few studies that have been done on that are pretty mixed. It doesn't really seem like there's a significant advantage taking place. In addition, it's not always the top private schools that are participating in these programs. So a lot of the top programs don't necessarily need an injection of cash via public scholarships, or they have their own robust financial aid programs. So what you see is sometimes private schools participating that aren't necessarily better than the public school kids are leaving. Indiana probably has the most robust data on this, and that's what we've seen there is that students are leaving public schools that are more highly rated than the private schools they're going to.
Wow. And that is the place where we see the most data. So basically, there's an attempt here to privatize the system. And Betsy DeVos has been very public in the past about her perspective on the idea of public schools. She says she believes in public education, but not public schools. So in other words, that taxpayers should fund people going to private schools where the taxpayer and our society has no ability to provide any oversight as to the type of education. And hence, a lot of this money ends up going to parochial or religious schools. Is that right?
Yeah, an overwhelming majority of schools that participate in these programs are Catholic or Christian. And I think what you need to ask is, if Betsy DeVos wants to see an injection of cash into these systems, if she wants to make it so that every student, when they're deciding where to go to school, they're looking at private and public schools, I think the question is, what if you're in an area where the only private schools available in the system are Catholic or Christian, and you might be Jewish or Muslim? It might not be the best system for you to be in. And it also begs the question of what happens to the public schools in this situation if so many kids are leaving.
All right, well, let's address those. I mean, because I think maybe it's maybe on some level it's even a misnomer to call these things these schools private schools as opposed to parochial schools. And I would imagine even if you are you identify as a Christian in some fashion, you may not want to go to a religious school, I guess, in that situation. So, okay, let's talk about what are kids learning? Well, before we get to what are kids learning there, what does it do to the public school system if we have a situation where, and people can imagine, I went to a city that was the second largest city in New England. We had 4 high schools. I don't know how many children that represented. I don't know, let's call it 10, 15,000, per grade or something like that, or maybe a little bit less. 10, 15,000 students in the high schools. What happens when there's this opportunity for X number of those students to take a sizable chunk of the budget that they represent and walk with that money and give it to a parochial or a private school?
Yeah, so again, that's something that we don't have a lot of data on yet. I think that it depends what side, your answer would depend on what side of the aisle you're on. I think public school advocates would say that it absolutely drains public schools of resources when you have kids leaving the system, and oftentimes these are kids who have more social capital than other children if their parents are out there shopping for different options. And I think private school choice advocates would say that it's not draining the public school system, and that, some of these points are largely irrelevant because no matter what, kids should be provided with a portfolio of options as to where they want to go to school.
All right, but so, I mean, you've done some research on this. I mean, so what happens? I mean, presumably, right? I mean, like in any enterprise, if the first amount of money exponentially, you start getting a benefit with the more students that are in there, right? Like you could say that we spend the same amount on each student, but the fact of the matter is once you get past this threshold, you can enhance the education for everybody. And once that money starts to drain out, clearly you're undercutting the funding for the public school.
Yeah, I think that's certainly what public school advocates would say in that situation, that when there's a certain mass of students that leave, that they no longer only lose a certain amount of per pupil funding from that student. They don't always lose all of that amount of money, but with that money goes money for things like they still have the same classrooms, they still have the same building, but they don't have necessarily the money to keep up the infrastructure in the building or to provide for those extra things. So they certainly become more cash-strapped, they would say.
All right, we got to take a quick break. When we come back, let's talk about what what students are learning in a lot of these schools. It is a curriculum that is not necessarily up to what we imagine our educational standards should be. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. We'll be back in a moment.